I'm a bit of a wanderer, so apologies if I slip on any of these mats as we go around. But we've got 10 minutes, so I'm going to go through it super quickly. I want you to come away from this talk knowing just two things. The first is what you put in your mouth every day is one of the biggest and most important decisions that you make. And the second thing is I want to give you a framework in which to think about health and nutrition, or food. So what this talk is not going to be about is, on the left-hand side, we have the common reasons that your doctor or your dietitian already use blood testing, and all of these things, glucose control, fatty liver, cardiovascular risk, all of these things are affected by what you put in your mouth. But you either know this stuff already, and I'll bore you, or you don't know it, and 10 minutes isn't enough to really understand it. And I also don't want to talk about what is the best diet. This stuff is kind of tribal, it becomes semi-religious, and that's not what we really want to talk about today. But all of these groups, they already use blood testing for different reasons. So vegans often checking vitamin B12, whether they're deficient, low carb. A lot of people are low carb. It improves your blood fats in quite a large proportion of people. It looks pretty bad for about a quarter of the population, so people want to see where they fit in, etc., etc. So this is not about that. So what is this about? I want to kind of define the problem that we're all trying to solve when we talk about food and health, and I also want to kind of give you some view of how this is going to come out in the future. And some of this is speculative, so please separate what I'm talking about from the company Werlabs. So to start with, what's the problem? Well, 50 million people alive today in Europe, 10 million people where I'm from in the UK are going to live to be 100. So the British government has been talking about this for the last 5 or 10 years. It's going to fundamentally change society. It's going to change the way you view marriage, the way you view work, and importantly, the way you view health. And the reason is that unless you in this room are saving kind of 20 to 30% of your income, you're going to have to work until your late 70s or early 80s. And that means you're going to have to take control and make sure that you stay as healthy as possible for as long a period of time as possible. And how does that actually look? This is like a kind of a drawing. It was a picture on the back of a napkin, but it's actually from, again, a British government discussion on the subject. And what you see here is that longevity is related to two things: the length of time that you live and the quality of that life. And the black line represents a typical human today. So from about the age of 35, your health begins to deteriorate. You don't see it very much. You may have some vague feeling around it. You can only see slight changes in measurements. Maybe your glucose homeostasis, your blood sugar control, starts to deteriorate a little bit. A really early sign is that you start to lose strength as well, and specifically types of muscle fiber in your legs. And then this accelerates as you get older. So this is why when you see your grandma or grandpa at Christmas and then you don't see them for 6 months, you notice that their health has deteriorated. It becomes much bigger and obvious than when you're kind of late 30s, early 40s. And to maintain this health span, we actually know what the interventions are that help this. And it's all around understanding nutrition physiology, sleep physiology, exercise physiology, and some forms of medication. But we're here today to talk about food. So do you believe me that nutrients actually matter? Well, this is actually from Cell magazine, which is the second most prestigious science journal after Nature. And this is the Max Planck Institutes for Aging in Germany. They were looking at all of the interventions around diets, exercise, etc., and whether or not in model organisms this affects both lifespan and health span. And you can actually ignore the left-hand side. What's interesting is the main mechanism of action. Almost everything affects your nutrient sensing pathways. So this is basically three things, which is mTOR, which is related to protein intake, insulin, which is related to your carbohydrate intake, and AMPK. But we have a problem. For humans, the species of interest, you can't do a long-term, well-controlled, randomized controlled trial. So ethics committees will not let you take a baby from a mother, put it in a metabolic ward, and see what it dies of 100 years later, unfortunately. So what you want to look for is, what structure can you put? What kind of things should you be looking for? So what you want is you want to go from simple-celled organisms all the way up to primates. And are there some interventions that seem to be conserved across different species? And the answer is yes. And I think just one really interesting example is the rhesus monkeys in the corner. And it's interesting because this has been a 20-year study carried out by the National Institutes of Health in the US and the University of Wisconsin. And they were testing the hypothesis, does calorie restriction increase both health span and lifespan? And annoyingly, in one set of monkeys it did. In Wisconsin, in the NIH, it didn't. So the Nature article was, calorie restriction doesn't confer an advantage. But what was really interesting is when you look at the data a little bit more deeply, what you see is that in Wisconsin, they were giving these monkeys the equivalent of a standard American diet, which they wouldn't eat. So they had to give them 25% sucrose, sugar solution, to get them to eat it. And then in the NIH, what they did is they gave them something relatively similar to a natural diet that the monkeys would have in the wild. And in that case, there was no advantage for calorie restriction. But the interesting thing was, if you eat a shit diet, you should have less shit, and then you seem to have an advantage. But this actually points to something much more interesting, which is ignoring calorie restriction. Some form of dietary restriction seems to confer an advantage in both the length and the quality of the life that you live. And I think this is one area that we're going to see a lot more science around in the next 5 to 10 years. And it's going to take us away from the kind of tribalism that I mentioned before. But that's one way that you can look at, what kind of things around diet can improve health. The second is to look at people that live to be over 100 years old, centenarians. What do they die of? Well, luckily for us, they die of the same things that we do. The 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, neurodegeneration, cardiovascular disease, et cetera, et cetera. But they show the first signs much later in life, and then they die at a much later time. So the problem you're trying to solve for is, how do you not get these problems in the first place, or how do you put off getting these diseases? And if you look at they seem to have around 20 different genes that confer a small advantage. And you may be sitting there thinking, well, if I don't have that genotype, then I'm buggered. But actually, what's interesting is that genotype, so the gene codes for something that is expressed through a phenotype. And what's really interesting about that is that if you look at ApoC3, for example, lower triglycerides, lower ApoB, those things can be affected by the decisions you make on what you put in your mouth. So I think we're going to get, in the future, a much finer-grained understanding of things that are going to impact our health and our lifespan. So, like I say, I hope I've left you at least interested to start looking at this kind of stuff a bit more deeply, and that you can come and talk to us afterwards if you want to. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Wolf. Thank you.
Cheers, everyone.
This was a pleasure.